Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We do very briefly here have some breaking news as the Miami Heat have just agreed to a max contract extension with Bam Adebayo. It sounds like this was reported on by Shams Charania. Don't have all the details in front of me right now, but it looks like it is a 3-year deal worth $166 million, which would equate to about $55 million per year, which is kind of crazy for somebody who isn't a traditional creator necessarily, not somebody that you are running your offense through, but I still do love Bam Adebayo as a building block. I think every single team could benefit from having them on the roster, and it's going to be curious to see what the future looks like in Miami, considering the fact that we do have some Jimmy Butler rumors that have floated around. They definitely have some moves that they need to make next season before, fully reestablishing themselves as championship contenders. And yet you see Butler, you see Spoelstra, you see that Heat logo. You can't, at least me personally, I never fully count them out, but I do think they have some work ahead of them as to whether or not they need to make some complementary moves. But we'll probably touch more on that tomorrow when we get all of the details. But for now, want to talk about the biggest questions ahead in the 2024 NBA draft. The draft obviously hasn't had necessarily all too much excitement around, any one individual prospect, which to some people seems underwhelming. Maybe they can't get a grasp of it the same way. There is a lot of international prospects and G League Ignite prospects that people aren't already familiar with, which kind of plays into that as well. But it's also a lot of unknown in this draft, and I think that is pretty exciting. So we're going to be touching on a number of the big questions surrounding this, starting with the number 1 overall pick and the Atlanta Hawks in terms of what are they going to do, because they are in this weird middle ground where last year they actually finished a little bit sub 500, 36-46, actually worse than I thought off the top of my head. But, a 36-win team that had a chance to go on to make the postseason and fell short, which really wasn't all too much of a surprise necessarily. The Hawks were somewhat of a mess this year, and I think at that point it was Trae Young coming back from his dislocated thumb or something along those lines, fractured thumb at the end of the year, that he wasn't necessarily, in his groove down the stretch of the season, and they were never a real threat to even, I think, make the playoffs, even with the play-in tournament. They were definitively the worst out of the 4 teams there, but now they're in this situation with the first overall pick, lucked into it a little bit. Obviously not quite these, superstar sweepstakes that is what we've seen the past number of years, but it is still a very interesting position to be in. I'm not sure if it is their best path here to use the number 1 overall pick. Now, it's a very strange situation, again, understanding that there isn't necessarily a superstar player available. Now, there are some guys out there that could help contribute. I think that specifically if you look at Donovan Clingan, could be a pretty good fit there in Atlanta, but you're drafting somebody who has pretty limited offensive upside, I would say, with the first overall pick. That doesn't necessarily sound like a great bargain. Now, obviously, as much as they currently play through Trae Young, it is very individual based and ISO heavy, that maybe Clingan would be the perfect fit because of that. They don't need another superstar guard to throw out there alongside Trae. It would be leaning into the idea of just building around him instead, and that's something that we saw a little bit with the Mavericks. Now, obviously, they went out to get Kyrie Irving, but the other guys of Derek Lively and PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford, these are all players that sort of play well into the system that is Luka Doncic. So maybe the Hawks try and lean into that. I think that they have a ton of questions ahead of them in the offseason, And I think it starts with the draft in terms of how they are going to choose to play this whole thing. But the number 1 pick is very much, a question as to who is going to be available. And that's in large part because of the fact that the player who is number 1 on most franchises boards, Alex Sarr, chose to not work out for the Hawks and would prefer to be drafted by the Wizards at number 2. So my next question here is, who does the fact that Alex Sarr doesn't want to be drafted by the Hawks number 1, who does that say more about, between Sarr or the Hawks? Now, I think it's really interesting because when you take it from the perspective of Sarr, you're going to use a top 3 pick on somebody who doesn't even necessarily, if you want to frame it in terms of he doesn't doesn't feel like he can be the number 1 overall pick, I think it's more that he is just looking at these situations and sort of understanding that in the modern NBA, you're going to make your money regardless of if you're number 1 or number 2. But it is an interesting concept that a player would pass up on, a couple $1 million and the pride of being the number 1 overall pick, even if he went at it from the perspective of, I'd like to go number 1, but I don't want to end up with the Hawks. And he hasn't outright said that he doesn't want to go to the Hawks, just that it sounds like he would prefer the Wizards. He'll play in Atlanta if that's where he ends up, but at this point for the Hawks, it's a pretty big risk for them of taking an international prospect that they haven't even been able to actually get in the building yet. So I don't think he's going to go number 1, and I think that ultimately it kind of says more about him than it does the Hawks. Now, the Hawks situation is a little bit dicey, I would say, in terms of being stuck in mediocrity some, not knowing what the future of the organization is going to look like, whether Trae Young and or DeJounte Murray is going to be there. I have a hard time imagining that they're going to run it back with both of those players on the team next season, but it's very much in play. I think it would be a mistake, but, at the same time, I can understand Sarr wanting to have more opportunities in Washington and wanting to continue to grow, but it does make you think a little bit in terms of the mental makeup of Sarr, who has already jumped around a number of different times, going from France to overtime elite, and then instead of sticking it out with overtime elite, or going to, a pro league in Europe or even the G League, he ends up in Australia with worse competition. So that is something at least to keep in the back of your mind in terms of, again, the mental makeup a little bit of Sarr. And from the interviews that I've seen, I don't question his character by any means, but it is an interesting, something to point out there. But next question here is, what is the Spurs' plan to rebuild around Victor Wembanyama? They currently have picks number 4 and 8 in this draft and seem like they would be in a golden position to potentially add some talent around Wemby if this were a normal draft. Now, obviously, reputation of it isn't that there is some sort of star forward or guard that is going to be, an answer, a true number 2 running mate to Wemby. And for me, I think that the most important thing is going out and getting a guard. And I'm curious to see whether or not they stick with the 4th and 8th overall picks, or if they end up trying to package those for something else. Would be interesting to see, but I would like to see them take a guard, preferably a Reed Shepherd or Rob Dillingham, to provide some level of just being able to throw an entry pass and to be able to space out the floor as well. Give Wembanyama some extra room to work with. I think that Stephon Castle would also be a little bit of an interesting pairing as well, throwing him into the mix with Wembanyama and Devin Vassell, but I don't know if Castle's going to be available for them at number 4. Again, a situation where could they potentially try and move up in this draft to go get one solidified guy? We'll see. But they also have the number 35 overall pick, and if they're going to stick there, I think I would be very interested in watching them take Tyler Kolek, the point guard out of Marquette. He is a smaller player, so I think in terms of IQ wise and just his ability as well, he has a pretty decent 3-point shot that he could very much be able to sort of play in less competitive situations. I struggle to see him being able to get some real minutes in a playoff series because of his size and his defensive concerns, that he would just be able to be pushed around too much defensively. But if you're talking about just a developmental track for Victor Wembanyama, I see no reason why Tyler Kolek can't be a part of that plan at a low value second round pick, just for the sake of trying to add some extra guards into the mix so that you don't have to play Jeremy Sohan at the point guard anymore. But really interesting there. And then the last question here, just sort of a brief one. Can Houston use this number 3 pick to pull off a surprise blockbuster deal at the draft? My thought process is probably not, considering the fact that nobody does seem to love this draft. But it is interesting to me that the Rockets, this is a golden opportunity for them. They see themselves, at least, that they are not going to be at the top of the lottery for the next number of years. So could they potentially try and package this into something that will further make that a reality? We'll see there. My guess would be probably not, again, because of the strength of this draft, but we will have to see. But we are running low on time here. We're going to take one last final break, and for our last segment, I want to talk about the top NBA draft prospects that I believe could help contenders immediately next season. So stick with us, and we will be right back.